I'm a faculty member in the agronomy department. My specialty is soil science. I specialize mostly in soil fertility and soil health. And it's my pleasure to talk to you all tonight about some DIY, or if you don't know what DIY stands for, do it yourself soil health monitoring. And let's get started. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you all tonight about is I'm going to give you my definition and some history on soil health. And as Alicia said, I will ask for some participation. I have some polls, so I'll get to see how much you know about soils and history. I'll talk about why monitoring soil health matters. And I think about monitoring soil a lot, and I do a lot of my work on monitoring agricultural soil, so row crop soils. But I know many of you in the audience are more interested in monitoring your garden's soil health. And a lot of what I'll be saying today translates to your garden soil health. And I'll touch on that more as we kind of go throughout the talk. I'll talk about one particular instance where we are measuring soil health or recovery of soil health under Prairie, and a practice in particular some of you might have heard of called the Prairie strips. I'll give some more details on that, and I'm going to walk you through a comparison of what I call gold standards, or it's the kind of traditional scientific way to measure some of these changes in soil health, which are usually very costly and out of reach for most regular farmers and also gardeners as well. And then a version that we think are just as good that you could do on the cheap, or inexpensive, I should say, and you could do it yourself, and with mostly items that you can find in your kitchen or garage. I'll wrap it up with some conclusions, some final thoughts. I've got one final poll question. And then if there are any questions, I should have plenty of time for questions at the end of the talk here tonight. But if I don't get to your questions, my email address is down there in the corner, marsh@iastate.edu. And you're more than welcome to email me about any questions. I'll have that email again. And one other thing I want to mention is that I will have a QR code at the end that has all the scientific papers. It has my slides in case you would like to look at my slides and look at something in more detail later. And it has a little bit more information than I'm having here as I go through this talk with you. So you're more than welcome to click on that and find those documents there. I'm also on Twitter, or what is now known as X, formerly Twitter. And you can see all the cool stuff that my research team does at the handle at soil_plant_IXNS, which is short for interactions, soil plant interactions. Okay, let's get started. So some of you might be familiar with Google's work in this sphere, where they've been scanning English documents and other language documents going back to the 1800s. So on the x-axis, or the bottom here, is the years that Google has gone back and scanned magazines, books, articles, periodicals, you name it. All of those things are being scanned and put in a database. And what's neat is you could go to this website if you just put in Google search Ngram Viewer. What will pop up here is this demonstration that shows you the trends in time of these terms: Frankenstein, Albert Einstein, and Sherlock Holmes. The numbers on the far left, what we call the y-axis, are arbitrary. They're just a percent in all of human literature that those terms were used. And you could see terms like Albert Einstein didn't show up until about the 1920s. It was on the zero line, and Sherlock Holmes until about the late 1880s. So I'm going to use Einstein as an example. He's a scientist. He's not a soil scientist. He's a physicist. I won't hold it against him. But any of you Einstein aficionados would know that he was born in 1879. Still that blue line. Of course, no one's written about him yet in popular press, magazine articles, newspaper articles, books. He published his theory of relativity in 1909. Still nothing written about him yet, so that's why the line is still at the blue. And then about 10 years later, oops, I'm sorry, About 10 years later, his name starts to take off. I hope you can see my pointer here. I'll change it to the laser so you can see it better here. It starts his use of his name starts to take off after he published what's probably his most famous piece of work, which is on the theory of relativity. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with soil health? Well, I went to Google Ngram and I put in a couple terms. I put in 3 terms that relate to soils and soil health. The first term I put in was soil tilth. Many of you probably aren't familiar with this term because it's not used very much anymore, but soil tilth is more of the physical capacity of a soil to act as a seed bed. It's a term that maybe my grandfather used. He grew up in a peanut and cotton farm in southeastern Oklahoma, but it's not no longer used very much. As this Google Ngram data shows you, it peaked in about maybe 1955 and then has gone down. The next term here, soil quality, started to take off in the 70s, really took off in the 90s. Then in the 2000s, that term is kind of decreased in usage a bit more. Finally, I'm showing you the term soil health, which when I put this term in here, one thing that was surprising is this bump here in the kind of late 1940s, early 1950s. Then it seemed to go down and really has taken off in the late 80s, 90s, and is continuing to increase. And, you know, in my line of work, I hear a lot of farmers talking about soil health. And it's the reason I show this is because it's evolved from terms before it, soil tilth, that focused only on the physical capacity of a soil, soil quality, which is more of like I'd say more an aesthetic an aesthetic or like a anesthetized version of soil health. It's not as lively. It doesn't incorporate the idea that soils are a living entity. So this is our first polling question here. I want to ask you all, what historical event occurred around these peaks where we saw a lot? So remember, what these peaks represent is how much these terms were used in all of human literature. And there was one in soil health around the late 1940s, early 1950s, and there was one in soil tilth and just a little bit afterwards. And remember, if you go back to the Einstein example, there's a time lag about 10 years between when something happens, or in Einstein's case, when he becomes famous and when his name starts to become popular. So I'm going to start the poll here. What historical event, and I think you get 20 characters or so, 12 or 15 characters maybe. What historical event occurred around this time or before that might have caused the change, at least in soil health and soil tilth? Give you a couple more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll. I don't know what's going to happen when I press share results. I'm not even sure how I look at it. I should have tested this out. But the correct answer is also followed up by another question. So let me ask another question. Um, the correct answer is the Dust Bowl. And I have a follow-up question is, who said this quote? We'll see how this one goes. Some of you history buffs will probably be able to get this without even knowing the context of soil. Okay, so I've been giving a minute on the poll. I'm going to end the poll. Those of you that got your answer in, the correct answer is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he said this in 1937 during what is considered probably the most catastrophic event related to soils in our nation's history. And these are a few of some of my favorite photos showing just how bad this was. On the bottom left, you could see this dust storm that's several stories tall coming through Spearman, Texas. Then there's a photo from Dallas, South Dakota, where whatever this vehicle is, maybe a Model T, almost covered up with silt. And this actually was a major historical event. And, as this quote that's very famous that FDR said about soils, there was a lot of legislation that was enacted to conserve soil, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service was created and led to a lot of policies that and had echoes to today in conserving soil. It also caused that peak in soil health, as I showed. But one of the things that we've learned since then is that we haven't completely solved our soil health issues. So while we haven't had a catastrophic event like the Dust Bowl, we do have some issues with soils that I'll mention in the context of soil health here. So this is a graph showing a timeline from years after Euro-American cultivation. So these are when settlers came in and began farming in Iowa. So this is an Iowa context, but this can translate to other areas as well. And on the left side of the zero, there's no units because we'd have to go back more than 12,000 years in the Des Moines lobe, which this is the Des Moines lobe. It's this area that's most recently glaciated. The soil started to develop here about 15 to 17,000 years ago as the glacier receded. And then under an oak savanna prairie, those soils developed what is their 100% or what their organic matter was to begin with. Then we know as those glaciers receded, there were Native Americans farming in Iowa 3,000 to 4,000 years. These are all sites where Native folks were growing corn, and you could see that most of them are along riverbeds. There aren't very many in the Des Moines lobe, a couple here and there. Many of them are kind of closer to the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. But there were people farming in the area. And then Euro-American cultivation begins in the 1850s to 1900s, late 1900s in Iowa. We know that this has caused a loss in about 50% organic matter, and so I abbreviate it as SOM, soil organic matter. And it's also led to a loss of what that soil does for us. And right now I'm going to leave it at a technical term called soil ecosystem services. So we know from long-term experiments like the Marrow plots in Illinois, which is a very famous experiment at University of Illinois that dates back to the mid-1500s or 1850s, that tillage and other cropping practices have led to this decrease in soil organic matter. But I am not here to be all doom and gloom about it. In fact, this is what gets me up in the morning and excited to work with farmers that want to improve their soil health. So I see this as a glass is half full. And a lot of these growers that I work with through organizations like Practical Farmers of Iowa, they're looking for ways to do what I call here a management intervention. And this is all about the soil health movement. This is what it's all about. These growers that want to do this want to regenerate soil organic matter, restore soil ecosystem services or the functions. I'll mention that in the next slide. And then it's really about monitoring it, just like many of us do now with our Fitbits. We're trying to monitor improvements in our fitness or our health. They want to monitor if their trajectory increasing soil organic matter and other properties and functions of soil looks like this, maybe is seeing no change, or might be in a higher trajectory, increasing this quickly after a management intervention, this quickly. So that question is really underlying what the soil health movement is about with farmers, but also you all that are thinking more in a gardening context. Let me return to that idea of soil ecosystem services. So this is a figure I like to use in my soil fertility class, but I use it when I talk to farmers as well. In agronomy, the prime directive for those Trekkies out there is to provision or grow food, fiber, and fuel, right? That's the number one purpose of soils. There are these other purposes or functions, things that kind of support or benefit humans and the rest of life on Earth. Like some of my archaeologist friends, they look at soil as a medium that preserves our artifacts of our past, tells us about our history. My engineering friends look at soils as a foundation for human infrastructure, having buildings on top of soil. You need stable soil for that. You can use soils as a source of genetic resources and pharmaceuticals. But all of these ones that I highlighted in red and I have in the center, the hub, soil organic matter, all of these are related to soil health. And in the soil health movement, we're looking beyond agriculture's or agronomy's prime directive, provisioning of food, fiber, and fuel. And we also want soils that sequester carbon, purify our water, regulate climate, cycle nutrients, provide a habitat for organisms, and regulate flooding. Those are all things that I like to call soil ecosystem services. That's the technical term for it. But when you look at those holistically, that is what soil health is all about. And some of these functions are more monetized than others. So some of you might have heard about carbon market programs. There are carbon market programs that are working with farmers to get them to sequester carbon and using practices like no-till and cover crops. But I'm going to come back to that in just a second. All practices like that fall under, this is from the NRCS, under 4 soil health principles. So these are principles within each of these. There are practices like no tillage or cover crops that will increase soil organic matter and restore those soil ecosystem services or functions and restore soil health. This isn't a comprehensive list. This is just a list of some of the practices that I focus on and think about. But under minimized disturbance, practices like reducing your tillage or going no-till, doing what's called controlled traffic farming, so not running your machinery all over the field, but kind of keeping it concentrated in certain areas, so only a portion of your field's compacted. Using CRP or prairie strips strategically to take land out of production that might be marginal or have sensitive soils. For maximizing biodiversity, we're really talking about plants and animals. So farmers are using cover crops or crops that are not harvested, but usually planted in the fall and over winter that protect soils. So that's an example of adding biodiversity. Extending crop rotations, intercropping or growing 2 crops at once is shown to be beneficial to soil health. Using CRP or prairie strips, grazing cover crops, seeding pastures in rotation, even adding animal manure rather than synthetic fertilizer has soil health benefits. For the principle of maximizing cover, you can add cover crops, use perennial crops like some of you might have heard of Kernza. It's a perennial wheat crop. We also work with a perennial biomass crop called Miscanthus. Leaving more residue on the field helps provide a blanket and protect soil from erosion, reducing tillage, and then using CRP or prairie strips. So you're probably noticing some of these practices appear under more than just one soil health promoting practices or principles. Cover crops, so maximizing living roots, the idea of extending the duration that roots are in the ground has a lot of great benefits, including protecting soils from erosion, but also inputting food for microbes and the soil biology to kind of regenerate that soil health and kind of increase nutrient cycling efficiency. And most of you, I saw as people were typing in where they're from, I saw most folks are from Midwest states. And in the Midwest, one of the reasons why we have some persisting soil issues is that we are growing crops or we have a living root only less than 50% of the year. corn soybean rotations make up most of the agriculture in the Midwest, and having those living roots for only less than half of the year is not ideal. So that's why farmers are looking towards cover crops, winter small grains that might overwinter, perennial crops, like I had mentioned earlier, relay cropping, so growing more than two crops in a year, and then of course using perennial grasslands like CR Conservation Reserve Program or prairie strips. I'm going to focus on the CRP and prairie strips as that example that I mentioned. I'm going to go through and compare some gold standard and do-it-yourself soil health tests, but I'll come back to that in a moment. First, I want to talk about how we measure and what's in a good soil health test, or the ingredients within a soil health test. This is from a paper back in 2000. John Duran has done a lot of great work in the soil health field at University of Nebraska. Um, he has this list of ingredients in good soil health tests. A good soil health test should be sensitive to variations in management. In other words, it should change with that management intervention I mentioned about kind of reversing degraded soil. It should be well correlated, or it should relate to some of those beneficial soil functions: carbon sequestration, the provisioning food, fiber, and fuel, nutrient cycling, filtering water, all of those things. There should be a cause and effect known. So if you have a low test, how can you relate it to that soil function? And more importantly, how can you get to a higher value on a particular test? It should be comprehensible and useful to land managers, or in your case, gardeners. And then what you could do about it. So what management intervention might raise your soil health test level? And finally, it should be easy and inexpensive to measure. And this one is really a pet project, and like one of my favorite ones of these ingredients, because if a soil health test does not meet this last one, then a grower is never going to use it. It needs to be easy and inexpensive to measure. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the commercial labs out there. They're not very inexpensive. So this is a list. I'm not picking on everybody here. It's not a fully comprehensive list, but these are some of the common labs in the United States that growers that I work with will send their soils to. And some of these tests, so I've got the organization AgSource. Cornell has their own soil health suite and soil health packages that you could analyze your soils on. You could send garden soils to these institutions, and they can measure these tests for this cost over here on the right-hand side of the table. Midwest Labs, Woods End Laboratory. They have several. Each of these labs have a couple different packages. They usually have a basic that just includes the measure of soil organic matter, pH, plant available nutrients, what I would consider kind of a basic soil fertility package. They could give you cation exchange capacity, how much base saturation you have. And then if you pay a little more, you get more for it. You get some more physical measurements, you get biological measurements, more beyond the chemical routine soil fertility tests. You can see that the range in values is from $45 up to $165 per sample. So that's quite a bit of money if you're a farmer and you own a couple thousand acres and need to send one soil sample per 2.5 acres. The average is $83. So even if you look at the average, but you could be spending up to $165. So these tests are expensive and prohibitive, and restricting growers from understanding their soil health and measuring it themselves. So the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk more about some alternatives to those expensive tests. I want to talk a little bit about folks that have been looking for ways, including our research team, to allow people to measure soil health on their own, or DIY, do it yourself. Farmers and ranchers and even private citizens like you all that might be using small gardens or becoming involved in agronomic and soil science research. We call this citizen science. This participation can take many forms. You can collect data, share records, provide access, and you can provide your own experiments. You can divide your garden in half, or better yet, into a couple different plots and add biochar, for example, or fish emulsion or some other alternative kind of fertilizer source. And then stakeholder involvement in this kind of citizen science, when you're bringing it together with more traditional scientists like myself, can really result in some cool and powerful stuff and looking at trends in large areas. And an example of this is some colleagues of mine from Europe, and in the UK in particular, had used tea bags to decompose in gardens, home gardens. So this is where it gets relevant to you. So Sarah Dudigan and her co-authors here buried green and red tea, rooibos tea, in what's called the tea bag index. And I'm not going to go through a lot of details on this. This is what the tea looks like. It's in nylon mesh bags, so you could use a trowel, bury it in your garden, and then dig it up in a couple months and measure how much of the tea was decomposed. And it's a measure of biological activity. There have been several studies. I included these papers in the Google Drive document that I'll share at the end of my talk. So if you want further information about this, you can find it in that Google Drive, especially about this paper in particular. But this is just showing a few of the experimental treatments that some of the citizen scientists, kind of like you all, who are maybe gardening and thinking about performing your own experiments, they had gardeners bury the tea bags in a lawn with no amendment, a vegetable patch where they might have had amendments like fish emulsion or manure, and then a vegetable patch with no amendment. Okay, so let's talk about some of these. Let's talk a little bit about some of these tests here. This is a list of DIY soil health tests, including the Lipton tea. You can also bury cotton underwear. There's a few people were doing this a few years ago, doing the soil your undies test by just burying cotton underwear. But you can also measure bulk density, which is the mass of soil per unit volume. You can measure aggregate stability, or how well soils hold together. Here's the materials needed, what soil health function is being measured that I mentioned in that FAO chart, and then a paper for more reference on the method. You could count earthworms in your garden in a more systematic way, other than just kind of sitting in front of your garden and watching for earthworms. You can measure soil erosion potential. You can measure respiration. So this one costs a little bit more. You have to buy these paddles that read respiration. You put your soil in a jar, and you can measure how much your soil is breathing, which is a good indicator of biological activity in the soil. You can also measure how much water your soil holds. You might notice in the materials needed that there aren't a lot of main materials needed here, and they're not very expensive. But one thing that is kind of common in almost all these tests is a two-place balance. And last time I looked on Amazon, these are pretty inexpensive to get a pretty accurate balance that goes out to 2 decimal places, where you can weigh things like the tea, or you can weigh your soil and then dry it in a microwave oven or in your home oven. And I have more information on all these methods if there's any one in particular you're interested in. I'm going to focus on 2 in particular. I'm going to talk about aggregate stability, and I'm going to talk about water holding capacity. So the first and the last one in more detail in the context of the prairie strips. And I need to give you a little bit of context of this experiment. It is widely known. There are a lot of people who are familiar with this already. It's a practice that was started at Iowa State by my colleague, Lisa Schulte-Moore. Her and a few other colleagues began the prairie strips experiment, which is science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips. So the idea is you grow crops like corn and soybeans, and you have a strip of restored native prairie in between. This is a photo from an on-farm trial, not from the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, the original prairie strip site. But in 2014, there were a lot of farmers that got interested in this practice and started doing them on their own farm, like this photo that I'm showing you here. Another major milestone was that the prairie strip practice became part of the Conservation Reserve Program in 2018 under CP 43, and it's really exploded. And now there's 15 states, including many of the states I saw you all were from, with 22,000 acres of prairie strips protecting 150,000 cropland acres. And what do I mean by protected? Let me talk a little bit about the results, but before I do that, I want to give a shout out and some info if you want to find out more about the prairie strips practice. There's a nice website that has a lot more about it. You can also follow them on Twitter at Prairie Strips or X. I still call it Twitter. So as I mentioned, my colleague, Dr. Lisa Schulte-Moore, she's professor in NREM and co-director of the Bioeconomy Institute. She published a paper in 2017 that really summarized a lot of the findings from STRIPS 1. And essentially it boils down to disproportional benefits. So even though a grower takes a portion of their field out of production to put prairie there, and there are many aesthetic reasons and other reasons why a grower would do this, taking land out of production, these are all the environmental benefits we found. So Lisa and her team found that there's 37% less runoff. So this is runoff water that leaves the field and usually leaves with nutrients. There's 95% less sediment loss, but the statistic doesn't really do the justice of the finding, and showing you photos is better than a 95% statistic. So this is a prairie strip watershed or catchment, or sorry, this is a control with no prairie strip. You can see this is what's called an H-flume weir. It's collecting water and also sediment in this case. And this is a prairie strip catchment that has a filter and a contour prairie strip in it. And you can see the water coming out of it, and it's clear. There's a little bit of algae growing in there. This was a very wet period of time when they went out to collect this picture, but this is really showing you what the main idea of the prairie strip is. And it's not only to reduce sediment loss and water runoff loss, but reduce nutrients with it, like phosphorus, 38% less runoff nitrogen. There's less water and nitrate in groundwater in the prairie strip catchments as well. And there are many other benefits, including we were interested in measuring some soil health benefits. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that. At the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, this is what the experiment looked like. There were different catchments that had a different proportion of prairie strips in them. So this green vegetation are the prairie strips. The rest of the brown bare soil is the cropland. We compared the control catchment, and we actually have, this is called a paired catchment experimental design. So we had imagine 3 of these paired catchments, and this was the prairie strip catchment. So 10% of a contour prairie and also some foot slope prairie to kind of filter any excess sediment too. So my former graduate student, now postdoc, Cole Dutter, pictured up here, he and Liz Reiki from the Soil Health Institute sampled under these in kind of the equivalent landscape position in the control catchment, and then also sampled over here in the prairie strip 3 times, and then imagine this multiplied by 3 at 3 different paired sites. And they sampled 12 years after the prairie strips were established. And we know from other data that soil organic matter increases about 1% per year, or 0.01% of organic matter. And we saw that the prairie strip, so organic matter, which is probably one of the best. It's expensive to measure. It's something you can't do yourself, but it increases at about 11%. If you take that over 12 years, it's about a 0.03% organic matter per year, which is 1% of the average, which is about 3%. So indeed, even though these aren't large swaths of land converted to CRP, where you get a 1% increase, we do know that these prairie strips are increasing soil health. So where does that come into with DIY soil health movement? So I just want to show you evidence that indeed the prairie strips are increasing soil health. this is a team of grad students and postdocs that have done the work measuring soil health, kind of the gold standard way, the expensive way in a lab, and then an inexpensive way with a DIY test from that one of those tests in that table that I showed you before. And I mentioned I'm going to talk about stability of aggregates and then also the water holding capacity. So in aggregates, you want a soil that can resist wind and rainfall and not be eroded like those pictures from Prairie Strip. And we want to know if a soil is becoming disaggregated and which makes it more likely to be blown away or washed away with rain or wind, or it stays intact and is more stable. And the gold standard ways of doing this are Cornell sprinkle infiltrometer or the wet sieving method. And there are two do-it-yourself methods of doing this, the Slake's mobile phone app and a slaking test. Here's a video of this, the Cornell infiltrometer, and two different locations. You could set it up in a lab. It essentially acts as to evenly distribute rainfall over aggregates, and then you capture what aggregates are left after this kind of simulated rainfall. These gentlemen are outside doing it, and this water here would drip inside this sieve, which would have soil in it, and you measure what was left. This shows another method of doing this. This is using some fancy apparatus. This is quite expensive, and there are two methods. One are using these little cups, and you dunk the sieves repeatedly in water and then measure how much of the soil kind of remains in these sieves after dunking it several times for 5 to 10 minutes. In kind of an alternative fashion and something that's very inexpensive, there's a mobile phone app. It used to be called the Slakes app. Now it's called the Mulder app for soil aggregate stability. And you could tell from this photo in the app, this is the research paper where they published it, that it uses image analysis. So you put your soil aggregates into a Petri dish. You could set this up on a stack of books. If you have a stand for your phone, you can place it in that stand and start the app. But this app's for free. I'm going to show you a video of it in action. So this is the app just getting started. He's pulling it up on his phone. I can't help but dance to this funky music too. I'm sure you're all dancing at your chairs. So it's pretty easy to walk through. You can name your sample. There's instructions even, but you can see the person using this demonstration is skipped the instructions and called their sample awesome. So now those are the soil aggregates. He tapped on the phone so that the image analysis software recognizes the aggregates. He's taking a reference image, so setting it up while the soil aggregates are dry. Now he's put the Petri dish back wet, and he's going to drop the same aggregates inside, and now starting the app software. And you'll notice over time, the aggregate size is growing as that aggregate's dissolving. And the faster your soil dissolves, the less stable it is. You want a soil that kind of stays intact and small when you put it in water. It takes about 10 minutes to run this. Don't worry, the video is only 2 minutes. I'm keeping track of time here. So that provides you a stability score. The lower the score, the more stable your aggregate is. So that was a demonstration of the Slakes app. So a free mobile phone app to measure aggregate stability rather than equipment that costs several $1,000s. I'm going to show another method. This is a former graduate student and postdoc that was here at Iowa State, Renee Dietzel. Her and her husband own Lost Lake Farms, and they did their own trial in a tilled field and a pasture field, a field that's been in pasture for 10 years. Which one of these do you think is the field that was tilled, and which one do you think is the pasture? I don't have a poll question for that. Just answer it to yourself or put it in the chat. I like the bird chirping in this one. It's a nice contrast to the wailing guitars in the last video. So if you said the one on the right was the 10 years of tillage, you would have been correct. So this is you don't even need a mobile phone for this test, right? So this showed how the soil quickly dissolved when put in a like an onion bag mesh compared to the one that had been in pasture for a long time. So I want to show you how values of the Slakes test compared to some of these under the prairie strips again. So we're returning to prairie strips after I've showed you these demos. This is the stable aggregates remaining. This is the percent. So a higher number means more stable aggregates. The sprinkle infiltrometer was that first mechanism I showed you that had water hanging over the sieves. This is the wet sieving method where you dunk the sieves. The open symbol here is the average, and each of these were the different catchments. So those are also an average of 3. Just to show you the variability, there wasn't much variability. And you could see across all 3 of these about the same percent increase in stability. So this is a stability score that we kind of modified from the Slakes app, but they all show an increase of about 50%. So in other words, using an inexpensive mobile phone app gives you essentially the same results as these gold standard, difficult to do, expensive ways of measuring aggregate stability. And I'm going to skip the water holding capacity. These results will be in the folder in case you're interested in it. And I want to just wrap up, so I've got plenty of time for questions. And essentially, the take-home message is that humans can make soils less healthy. We know this from decades and decades of research on soil properties and management practices. They're affected by, and how they're affected by management practices. The soil health movement is interested in turning this around, and monitoring change is a big part of that, and monitoring it with inexpensive ways of measuring soil health is ideal, especially to expand and measure changes in soil health on more farms, right? It's okay if you've got a long-term experiment like I manage here at Iowa State, and you have the money and resources to pay for one of these expensive soil health tests. But there are many inexpensive DIY tests out there, and also it's just fun. This is what I mean by other benefits. Taking a video, performing these tests, posting it on social media. It's fun, and you can learn a lot about soils by doing it as well. For all of you that are interested in really spending some big bucks, you could get this on Amazon, which is kind of a comprehensive DIY kit that was developed by John Duran and other scientists at the USDA, ARS in Nebraska, and University of Lincoln. But that's quite expensive. This is for only the very serious folks. Okay, so I'm going to skip. I want to make sure I've got plenty of time. I'm going to skip my last poll question, which is just whether or not you think you might use one of these soil health tests. I want to thank a bunch of people, including folks in my lab that helped contribute the data. We had funding from USDA, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, Food for Food and Agriculture, or Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. And then I want to just say again, remind folks that if I don't get to your question, which I should have 12 minutes or so for questions. And my email is right there. You could follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at that handle. And then if any of those documents you want, including the test I wasn't able to get to, the water holding capacity, you can just hold your phone up to that QR code, or I think you might be able to screenshot it in on your computer if you don't have your phone handy. And that should take you to a Google folder that has all the papers. It has my slides, anything else you need if you don't want to ask me a question.